Good evening, all. Welcome once again to a live in conversation from the Royal Society of Medicine as we move into our third year and as the series continues. So you can tell from the lovely picture I have now, you probably already recognize the guest tonight. It's Dr. Ben Goldacre, who's had an extraordinary career, starting with the best-selling Guardian column, a stand-up comedian, a scourge of the establishment, be it science, medicine, or government, the co-founder of the Bad Science website and author of the best-selling book, Bad Science, to now the ultimate in being a member of the establishment. He's just finished an independent review for Sajid Javid on, well, we'll find out what it is in a second. So congratulations, Ben. And indeed, and to quote yourself, as it were, you're not just Ben Goldacre now. To give you your full title, you are Professor Ben Goldacre. When did that happen?
Oh, God, about 5 minutes ago. In fact, today I was admitted into the senior common room of Jesus College, Oxford.
Oh, right. Was there ceremonies? Did you have to kind of perform unnatural acts or drink quantities of ale, or?
Everybody, you've got to have your gown on. Everybody goes into the sound of the Batman theme tune.
Well, so well done. Well done. Yeah. Who would have thought it?
I don't like it. I mean, I do.
Yeah,
I don't.
Of course you do.
It makes you sound old. And a friend of mine said recently that in any case, nobody's ever pleased to be made a prof, because for every academic in the world, they're always cross because it's always 3 years too late. So nobody ever celebrates.
Well, it was prophesied by absolutely no one, which of course is untrue. Everybody knew this is how it would end, Ben. This is how it would end. So let's start out then with what you've been up to, because you've been in the news a lot since you landed your report, and that's really where I want to start. So your report, better, broader, safer. That's a parody of the Olympics. Is that deliberate? Faster Hearts.
No, it's a song by that band whose name I can't remember, from France.
Oh, is it? Right.
Anyway, it's the pitch. We want better, more efficient use of data. We want more people using it, but we also want it being used more safely.
Right. So let's start out then with a discussion of what was the problem that your review was intended to, and I'm sure will, resolve. So what's the background to it?
So fundamentally, like you, I've been going to meetings, well, for a couple of decades, for you maybe longer, where people say,
thanks,
where people say things like, British medical data, some of the most powerful stuff in the world. We can be world leading. It's got this enormous resource that has enormous potential to revolutionize service improvement and life science innovation, as well as research. But we never seem to quite capitalize on that. What we've got is a series of quite piecemeal projects where small amounts of data get shipped around, and we've never really cracked the productivity, but also scaling it up to have more and more people working on the data. So the challenge was, how can we push this forward? How can we capitalize on the value of what we have? And so in outline, although we submitted and published 100,000 words, and I can explain, if you like, why that wasn't an insane thing to do, essentially our pitch came down to 4 recommendations. Number one is stop taking... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think I'll spend a little bit longer on the problem, because I think that's before we get geeky into your solutions, because I mean there's a lot going on before, and I mean let's start out with for example care data, care.data, which I think was one of the stimulus that have led to where you are now. So, I mean, if I would say one thing that has brought about your report, it would be the fiasco of care.data. Tell us about what that was and why that went so wrong.
So care.data was a project that aimed to extract and centralize all GP data about all patients in the country, and then disseminate it out to multiple different users after taking names and addresses off to try and protect patients' privacy. And also to link it onto secondary care data like HES, SAS, and similar. It failed because people were concerned that the privacy aspects were not sufficiently robust. And I think overall, in broad terms, people were correct. The fundamental move that the system has typically made to protect patient privacy is known as pseudonymization. You remove names and addresses, and that prevents somebody accidentally spotting something that they then seeing something that they can't then unsee. So, for example, if I was working in Oxfordshire CCG, if I was doing a project on people who'd had fertility treatments, and I saw somebody I know from the school gate who hadn't told me that they were having fertility treatments, who didn't want me to know, then that kind of accidentally seeing it, I couldn't unsee it. If you take names and addresses off, you block that. But actually, you don't do very much to obstruct somebody who's willfully trying to invade somebody's privacy. And that's because the data that is held in somebody's GP record is so detailed, so granular, that if you know just a few things about them, you can usually identify an individual within it. For example, it would be very straightforward for me to identify my wife in GP data. I would look for somebody who had twins in 2013, another baby in 2014, the event codes moved from the London region to the Oxford region in 2015, and the rough date on which she was born. There's probably only one person who meets those criteria. Similarly, it's very easy to identify Tony Blair using things that everybody could find out about him, because he had an abnormal heart rhythm that was reset on 2 separate occasions when he was Prime Minister. And if you did a search just for people who had that particular procedure in the weeks in which it was in the news that he'd had it and Gordon Brown had to take over as Prime Minister, and his rough age, and you know roughly where they were, that's enough to identify him. And then, having identified the pseudonymous identifier for that individual, you then can go on to see everything else in their record, which they may not want you to see. Now, because that is a risk, and you have to recognize that it's a risk and think about it, the system has additionally put other safeguards in place. Now, to my mind, it's much better to put technical safeguards in place to protect patient privacy. But the system instead, because I think of a sort of a technical naivety and a lack of technical capability, instead we've relied on contracts and trust as a way to protect patient privacy. And so we have a very anxious and time-consuming bureaucracy of information governance that researchers told us was not just delaying projects, and we were given eye-watering stories of people doing whole PhDs before they actually managed to get access to a data set. And
yeah, definitely.
Another project got 2-year fellowships that reported nothing because they didn't get access, and projects that were never able to progress. Those delays arise because the system knows that disseminating data with names and addresses taken off is risky. And so you produce a bureaucracy that is driven by anxiety, where the rules are somewhat unclear, where you rely on giving the data in particular to people that you know reasonably well, which in turn is a sort of a rather regressive model, because what you want is for new people with new ideas to come in, including potentially some private sector innovators, and work on the data. But if you're so paranoid and so worried, rightly, about the insecure means that you're using to work with data, that you only want to give it to people you trust, then that blocks all of that good work. So, go ahead.
Well, you've obviously outlined very elegantly the risks and the dangers, but I mean, Roy Lilly, writing about your report, pointed out, which I think is true. He said he couldn't think of any actual major data breaches that had arisen from research using, for example, NHS records. And when you compare the old days, when we're always finding skips full of hospital records, which we don't find anymore because we don't have them. In the electronic age, the risk might theoretically look much bigger, but in practice, has this actually happened? Would be
firstly, the biggest problem caused by relying on pseudonymization of data is that it restricts the amount of work we do with the data at all. So,
okay,
if we haven't seen breaches, it's partly because we actually haven't been using the data enough, and I want to see a massive explosion in use of the data. Secondly, in many of the places that the data goes, you don't really have proper audit, or certainly open audit, that allows you to see where the problems have arisen. We can also see, and we know for a fact, that there are fairly regularly a trickle of breaches, and serious breaches, of individuals' privacy first of all, for medical records in non-research settings.
Yeah.
So the typical story is, you know, a creep practice manager will look up the details of his ex-girlfriend or girls that he knew at school and stalk them, for example, and sometimes disgruntled ex-partners. We also know that large administrative databases are often misused. So, for example, you know, I've got friends who are celebrities, for want of a better word, from my days doing showing off for a living.
Talk about that later.
And you know, they are occasionally subject to news media stories that are coming from people leaking information about them from a tax database, for example. And the tragic story of the woman who was kidnapped by a serving police officer on the streets of South London during the COVID pandemic. There's a BBC News story from about 9 months ago. 35 either serving police officers or civilian Met Police staff are currently under investigation for illegally accessing the detailed case notes of her kidnap and murder, and also the detailed and gruesome descriptions of the scene where her body was found. And that's 35 people who couldn't contain their desire to peek information, even when they must have known that they were operating in an environment where there was robust audit of all of their actions. And then lastly, I don't feel bad that I didn't name or report these individuals, because I think it is sufficiently commonplace. I am personally well aware of many situations where people have got large electronic health record research databases, which they have largely unfettered and unaudited access to, where they will, for example, without really thinking about it as problematic, do off-the-cuff analyses in that data without asking for permission to do it. And we may say that those are okay because it's reasonable for somebody to do a feasibility study or an early analysis outside of the permissions that they've got to work with the data, that no great harm comes. But that is nonetheless an example of people working with that data outside of the permissions that they have in an environment where there's no way of them being caught. So I think we shouldn't be complacent. And furthermore, it's not hard to engineer solutions which aren't just privacy preserving, but which are also more efficient and drive up the productivity of work with data.
Now, we're already getting lots of questions. I knew we would, and we will come to those as we go along. Still sticking on the kind of the before situation, people are pointing out big data breaches, the AOL and things like that. And the Veterans Administration on one computer had, which is about the same size as the NHS, numbers of patients, lost that computer. But my point was that although they did lose the records of huge millions and millions of people on a computer, nothing happened. The computer never found. So I think some of these are huge breaches, but they're not necessarily have led to detriment. Now, you mentioned Sarah Everard's murder, obviously. But I think that the third thing you said, that it depends on, you said contracts and trust, but you didn't put the third bit, which is retribution. And I've been involved, you have as well, I'm sure, in taking disciplinary and dismissal action against staff. It's happened, unfortunately, in our institution, in the hospital, who were looking at a celebrity's record, which they had no reason to do, and they'd been fired and removed from their professional register. So that's surely another protection that we have, which is your fingerprints will be all over it.
I think it's an important part of it, and I think we also do need larger penalties. It's a way of signalling that you take something seriously. It's also a way of getting that message spread. In the Middle Ages, if somebody nicked a loaf of bread, you'd put them in a cage on the edge of town, and their eyes get plucked out. But you do something really gruesome, just to really ram the message out. Before social media, before newspapers, if you want the message to spread, you've got to do something quite extreme. And I think that is proportionate in these cases, in particular because the second round consequences of misuse of data are actually quite substantial. Firstly, they may lead to patients not trusting their clinician and withholding information that they
yeah
people who are providing their care. But also, they undermine public trust in the whole project of us all sharing our data for the good, not just of ourselves, but also for more efficient planning of services, to monitor, improve the quality and the safety and the cost effectiveness of care, but also to drive research, which is what drives all of improvement and innovation in medicine. So I think these are not small things, but again, this isn't just about addressing the challenges of the current paradigm of frankly, a rather modest trickle of quite unambitious research projects in many cases. This is about creating secure platforms where we can confidently open up access to patient data for many, many more, infinitely more creative people in a competitive ecosystem of people innovating in the data, without having to worry about every single individual that we're sending data to, because we can provide access to that data in secure platforms that can be proven to protect patient privacy and that can produce complete logs in the open of everything that happens with the data, to show patients that what is happening with their data is proportionate, is useful, and is what we promised them we were doing with the data, because there are no secrets and no surprises.
And that's the issue of trust that you get into. And again, before we've still not got to your report, they're still coming up, don't worry. But trust also has been violated before your report, and rebuilding it is important. And two people, Nicholas Stringland has asked simply about what your views on sharing data with the private sector, and David Nicol. And assuming that's to David Nicol, congratulations, you're now the boss of the Royal College of Physicians, you poor fellow, so well done. Delighted you have an hour off to listen here. But David, he's pointing out, working in Birmingham, and he's troubled with how the government used Palantir, a US company with a poor track record of dealing with marginalized communities. So these are both about then your views on sharing data, using data with the private sector, with the for-profit sector. Let's put it that way. Where are you both before and after your report on that?
So a couple of thoughts. First of all, one of the things that went horribly wrong with care.data and the more recent attempt to download the GP data, and I'm worried where it's going with the current moves, although there is now a ministerial commitment to use trusted research environments as we've recommended. One of the things that worries me is people talk about public trust as something that is earned by just doing a little bit more comms, by telling people that you're trustworthy, or if we just told people about all the brilliant things we can do with data, then that will change their mind. In reality, you build public trust by earning it. You build public trust by saying to people, this is what we're doing to protect your privacy. This is how you can see that we're definitely following those rules that we've imposed upon ourselves, rather than by asserting that you are trustworthy. On the question of commercial access, I must say, I personally am not desperately concerned about private companies using NHS data to innovate and develop new tools and services that will improve patient care. I think it's important that the NHS gets a cut of that. We shouldn't be charging people cost recovery on the data. We should be getting a cut of the revenue that comes from innovation. However, I don't personally think that I should be the adjudicator on whether that's right or wrong. I think, as we say in the review, we need to have an open, frank public conversation about two topics that people have always tried to hide away from. One is, what do we think about commercial use of data? Now, the great thing about trusted research environments, secure platforms where people can have access to analyze the data, but where you can prove that patients' privacy is protected, as opposed to downloading the data onto your own machine. The great thing about trusted research environments is they completely disaggregate the two questions of, is it morally and politically and ethically okay for private companies to benefit from your data? And will this mean Google actually getting my electronic health record in a way that breaches my privacy? You can perfectly disaggregate those two questions. And I think that's really important because it helps to have a pure conversation about commercial innovation. And I think we need to do that. That's not a cop-out. It's actually more that, frankly, I feel like I know quite a lot about data infrastructure and data curation and epidemiology and the culture of academia. I actually don't have particularly strong views or knowledge about the right way in terms of microeconomic theory and driving innovation in the life sciences sector. I actually don't know very much about the good and bad side of giving private companies access to public resources, the best way to address monopolies, the best ways to drive innovation. It's not my thing. But what I can tell you is only give them access in a trusted research environment, and you no longer need to be having an argument about privacy. You're just having a conversation about the commercial.
Okay.
The conversation that I think has been really badly ducked is the use of data for service improvement. And I'll speak a bit more candidly than I did in the review, but not horribly candidly. Everybody wants to see everybody else's data to monitor their activity, but nobody wants anybody else to be able to see their data. So, you know, various bits of government get cross and sad that they're not able to access data from NHS England about what NHS England is doing and how it's doing on safety and quality and cost effectiveness metrics. NHS England, in turn, at various times, in various different ways, gets frustrated that it can't access information about individual GP practices or individual hospitals. And then in turn, individual GPs, quite reasonably, get worried not so much about their patient data being used to monitor their activity and outcomes for the purposes of service improvement, but rather they get worried about their data being used ineptly for service improvement. And actually, that is a really important issue. When we were setting up Open Prescribing, which is the service I run from my team in Oxford that lets everybody see what every GP in the country is prescribing, a few people around the system said, oh, well, you know, that's dreadful, because what if you do a bad job and GPs won't like it? They'll get cross with you because they won't like being ranked or graded in public, especially if you do it unfairly. We put a huge amount of time and effort into making sure that we were really sensible in the metrics we developed, but also we were clear that when you produce these kinds of performance measures, they are the beginning of a conversation, and there are often important other factors to consider. If you see a doctor who's prescribing huge amounts of benzodiazepines and opioids to their patients, they might be a soft touch, but actually it's quite likely that they're the local GP who specializes in managing people with substance misuse problems that none of their neighboring GP practices want to take on. So it's important that that kind of data science for service improvement is done thoughtfully. And some of the worst examples actually have come from national organizations, like when CQC in 2014 launched their intelligent data monitoring program, where they basically created a bunch of metrics, most of them from open data sources, about different GP surgeries, rank them all. And if you're in the bottom fifth,
oh God, yes, yes.
They put a press release that said the following 850 practices are at risk of delivering unsafe care.
Yeah.
Now that kind of careless framing of data around activity and outcomes, I think, is really unhelpful. It gives data science for service improvement quite a bad name. It also takes up a lot of time for frontline clinicians. So in the review, we say that there needs to be a serious open conversation about the rights and wrongs of it, because at the moment it's hundreds of separate conversations, always about individual metrics and often under the radar. We've got to have a serious grown-up conversation. And in my view, the right answer should be almost a licensing system where you have a reasonable expectation that people can use data for service monitoring and improvement, but that if they can be shown to have done something that was evidently sloppy and that it wasted clinicians' time or commissioners' time, that they should lose access, frankly, to that data.
Now, I'm duty bound, in fairness, to point out Marion Dwyer has said she works private sector in a multinational company, and she points out the penalties under GDPR, which is actually the same as university as well, A breach could lead to an $8 million fine or 2% of worldwide turnover. It's the same for public companies as well. So the penalties now for playing around wrongly with data or being careless or a single loss are huge.
The penalties are bigger. I think it's a bit of a problem actually that the penalties are bigger for companies than for individuals. And also sometimes there are challenges around the sort of the trail of contracts of exactly who's responsible. I personally would prefer individual accountability as well as corporate responsibility. But also, again, what we want is more people working with this data. And what you often see under GDPR, which is fundamentally about managing privacy risks through contracts and paperwork, is that it slows everything down. It still leaves enormous ambiguities in any case, because a lot of the language around anonymized and pseudonymized data actually doesn't really reflect the reality on the ground. But also you see things that are blocked under GDPR, which are actually perfectly proportionate, perfectly sensible, and perfectly helpful. So I'm not a wild fan of GDPR, but yes, I agree. There are now some fines, but it's better to manage this upfront by having secure platforms. And it's also worth saying that health has fallen dramatically behind other sectors in that regard. I often think that that medicine suffers from being an early adopter of data. If you look at William Farr's returns on hospitals, they're actually quite similar to his, but a couple of hundred years earlier. We invented techniques like randomized trials and a lot of the stats techniques that are used to detect outliers. But because we were early adopters, we got caught up in not legacy systems in the sense of old copies of Windows 95, but legacy ways of working and legacy teams. Meanwhile, ONS in the Secure Research Service have been running a trusted research environment for 20 years now.
Yep.
The only way that you can work with census data is by logging into their secure environment and working with it there, where in a remote desktop environment, you are provisioned data that's had names and addresses removed. You often get only a random subsample of the population to, again, try to protect data. And also where the granularity and the detail in the data is often pre-removed by pre-curation of the data before it's provisioned into that environment. So I find it very interesting, culturally, I suppose, that ONS managed to do that for such a long time, but that to the NHS, it's been a bit of a struggle. However, the great news is government, from the moment that we started shouting about this, well, not from the absolute moment, but you know what these arguments are, you know what these conversations are like. And I must say, actually, during the process of the review, there are in particular some senior civil servants where I have almost had my breath taken away by the sheer intellectual horsepower inside their head, behind the cozy jumper and the pale grey shirt. It is actually, it's always a mixed bag, but as soon as I started explaining the shortcomings of pseudonymization and the opportunities in trusted research environments, you could see lights going on in people's minds. You could see them also recognizing the efficiency gains to be had from that way of working, as well as the security benefits. And people have adopted it as a working method, and rightly so, of course. But so I've been very heartened by that all round.
Yeah, I mean, I did the Independent Review of Mental Health Act, and the civil service were absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Won't hear a word against them.
I mean, I do think separately there is a real problem with the way that government accesses, in particular, new forms of technical skills. So government knows how to work with doctors and accountants and lawyers and architects because they've been around for a couple of hundred years, and there are systems of certification and institutions that will say, no, this person really is an accountant, and they have passed this specific grade of exam, so you can trust them to do this. And by the way, that means you should pay them this much to do it. The challenge that the system faces with software developers and data scientists is that those aren't really certificated professions because they're too new. And actually, there's probably an inverse correlation between people who've got bits of paper they can brandish claiming that they're brilliant software developers and actually good software developers. And I can tell you that running a large team of software developers in Oxford. But also, they don't know how to hire them. They don't know how to task them. And I think that has also held back a lot of this work. And it has also driven a lot of the learned helplessness that you see and a lot of the rather chaotic procurement of data platforms. Building secure analytic environments for the NHS locally and nationally is actually not a very hard job. It's barely big data by any meaningful definition of big data. And it is the sort of thing that is entirely within the skill set of what you could deliver with.
You mentioned ONS as well, and Rebecca Mars is making the point that we're already doing these TREs, aren't we? You mentioned you sang the praises of ONS quite correctly. Your review is, I think, a little bit more circumspect about the HDR. Perhaps you might comment on that. But the question is this: that surely we've already solved the problem that your review was there to solve. Well, why don't we just get on and create a few more of these and we're done?
Yes. We must get on, create a few more of these, and then we're done. That's absolutely correct. I mean, look, a lot of people told us, both junior and very senior, that they were concerned about delivery of health data infrastructure, especially in academia. People told us that they felt data platforms and similar were funded, but then often seemed to disappear after the announcement of the funding, or appeared only in the form of PowerPoint slides rather than performant infrastructure. And I think a lot of that comes from the way that we procure this. The single strategic shortcoming to my mind is that UKRI and MRC don't have a panel for data infrastructure, covering things like developing and delivering innovative methods and open code for data curation, for secure analytics, and so on. So I don't want to single out any individual organization, but I think the funding model of, first of all, funding this kind of data architecture, this kind of intermediate work before you get to the single epidemiology analysis for the single epi paper. The whole notion of funding that kind of work through special arrangements with single organizations or effectively political preferment or via single relationships, I think is a very unhealthy way of driving a rich, competitive and collaborative ecosystem. We simply need open, competitive funding for people doing work in this space, and also for capacity building in this space. And we also need to do that, not just because it's a better way of delivering data infrastructure, but also because it's a way of giving status and independence to people with software and data engineering skills, because they told us repeatedly that they were often the junior party. Essentially, if you give money for data architecture to epidemiology researchers, you will get X years later some great epidemiology research papers, but you probably won't get data architecture that's very good. And the stories that we were told were actually really quite concerning of people working on large infrastructure projects funded by public research funders whose stated objectives were to produce collaborative shared data infrastructure and platforms. But they told us very clearly about how the center of gravity of the project, but also literally the money in the budget, was taken away from paying for software developers, for data engineers, and instead put on to individual researchers producing individual papers. In part, I think, because the PIs on those projects correctly deduced that funders like UKRI and NIHR would ultimately not be capable of recognizing whether a performant platform had or had not been delivered and that they would only be interested in the Lancet paper or not at the end of the pipeline. So I think we need to start funding teams that deliver software and methods around data curation, around secure analytics, around better ways of working with that data before you get to the point of the single academic research paper. And that's how we'll see innovation in this space. And I don't think any individual organization, even if they benefit from the current funding models, would really want to argue against that. It's the difference between, it's what makes British science so performant, I think. I mean, I'm straying into science policy territory that's outside my specialist sphere of interest, but my sort of rough gist impression of why British science productivity is so phenomenal is that we have open competitive funding at small project level, at program grant level, at centre level, where, albeit that we all complain that it's capricious and arbitrary and the idiots didn't recognise the genius of our proposal,
Indeed.
we can at least come up with an idea, propose it, it gets to a greater or lesser extent some kind of fair hearing, and then in many cases it might get funded, it might not. In the world of data architecture, of data curation, of innovative methods for secure analytics, there are tiny cracks, but for the most part, all of that money is given out through any means other than the open competitive funding mechanisms that have made British science great. So we need UKRI, MRC to simply have a panel like they do for any other specialist subject for this kind of data infrastructure, where people can propose ideas and deliver them. And then we will get software developers and data engineers working alongside researchers as independent high status researchers in their own right, owning projects and delivering well.
Now, yeah, good points. Very good. One of those particular panels, the MRC, did give you, at the start of the COVID epidemic, a reasonable sum of money to put this into practice. This is your OpenSAFELY grant. So, I mean, I think it'd be good to
actually, just to be clear, so I have personally, just to flag that this is not sour grapes, I have personally done really rather well out of the current iniquitous, closed, oblique and relationship-oriented funding mechanisms. My team has got millions and millions of pounds out of it, but I still don't think it's the right way to fund data architecture and data platforms. And you're right, the money we got from MRC to do OpenSAFELY, however, was in large part to do the research projects within OpenSAFELY, rather than for the platform as a service to give away to other people, which is where our heart was and which was what we wanted to do from the outset and what we're doing now.
Just to give, so people can see what you actually did with that money, which couldn't have been done in any other way. I mean, it was, incredibly successful. You had a good COVID, as they might say.
Yeah, horrible to say. So we built what I think is probably the world's largest electronic health record research platform. It's called OpenSAFELY. It's actually rather unusual in its design, in that, first of all, like any TRE, we don't disseminate data out to users, rather the data stays put. So we built our analytics platform actually literally inside the data center of the electronic health record providers, TPP firstly, and then more latterly EMIS. But secondly, we also built a number of new methods and software tools that allow you to curate the data in a reproducible way using standard data curation methods. So that's really important because that's a really efficient way of working with data. And that's one reason why OpenSAFELY has been so much more productive than other much larger and much more well-resourced programs in a similar space, because they were all relying on the old outdated model of Barbara does a SQL query and puts it on the shared drive, and then Tom does something magical in Stata with the dates, but we do the visualization in R, and all of that mess and the endless duplication of the pipeline for data curation and analysis and visualization. With our tools in OpenSAFELY, it's done in a standard way, and everybody can reuse every previous user's code. And that's really important. But we also built a framework that provably protects patient privacy. We share all code live as the code executes in some cases. And we also share all code by default at the point that results are published. And we have methods where essentially you write your data analysis code against randomly generated dummy data. And then when your code is capable of executing to completion, you press a button and it gets sent through into a sealed room, essentially, where it runs against the real data. And your answers, your graphs, your tables plop out into a folder and you can see those. But nobody is ever in, no researcher is ever in an environment where they can have tinkering access to the raw patient data. Now
you practice on fake data sets then, is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And
yeah,
people have talked about synthetic data before, but what they've always historically done for the most part is take real data, add random noise to it in the hope that they can obfuscate people's identity, but preserve the true statistical relationships in the data. But it just never works properly. So we don't use it in that way. We use randomly generated dummy data that you write your code on, that you practice on, as you say, and then it executes for real against the real data. Now, all of that laborious, innovative methods and code to implement those in practice is important because that's how we got access to the data. I didn't go to the NHS or to politicians and say, give me access to this data because we're nice or because it's important. There was a back and forth where we had to battle to explain why we were producing something that was more trustworthy than had ever gone before. And it was only by proving, by earning that trust, that we were able to get access to this unprecedented scale of data. So with that, we then went on to do a number of research papers. So for example, our first project was the largest study ever done on factors associated with death from COVID-19. So that was in 24 million patients. Every patient registered in a GP practice with System 1, TPP, as its electronic health record provider. And that was 5 weeks after project commencement in April 2020. We got the first paper out. That ended up being published in Nature. And it was the first paper that allowed us to disentangle the various different factors associated with death from COVID-19. So we could see from who was pitching up at hospital that there were more Black and Asian people than you would expect.
Yeah.
But nobody knew if that was because of, for example, a higher prevalence of heart disease, obesity, diabetes amongst Black and Asian people, or a relationship with social class, or any of the other things that may have been confounders or alternative explanations. And we were the first team that were able to do a really robust analysis. It was hugely well powered. We've gone on to publish dozens of papers since then.
Yes, I've noticed.
But just a couple that I think are really salient and really important.
Yep.
One was our paper on the prevalence of long COVID coding in primary care. That's a really important paper because that was our first research paper published using 58 million patients' full electronic health records. And that really is, as far as I'm concerned, a landmark in British science. I mean, it's awful for me to say that rather than somebody else. But we felt it, and we felt like a small scrappy team. You know, we felt like Roger Bannister doing the 4-minute mile in his plimsolls after eating a cheese sandwich. It was the fight of our life, and it nearly killed us. And it's testament to the amazing collaboration with TPP and EMIS as well, and the London School of Hygiene EHR research team. But 58 million patients, full records. And that is, by the way, every patient, every diagnosis, every prescription, every blood test, every referral, all the demographics. It is a phenomenal scale of data. It's about 60 billion rows of information in total. And I think you know from running teams that work with it, that this is difficult data to work with. It's easy to get it's easy to get the wrong answer. If you take shortcuts, especially in how you convert raw patient records, which are essentially an aid memoir for clinicians, right? To convert those into a two-way table you can use in a regression with a variable that says this patient does or does not have diabetes. There is no single variable for patient has or does not have diabetes.
Yeah.
If you want that, you're querying God's giant SQL database in the sky. What you get in the GP record is prescriptions, blood tests, referrals, maybe diagnostic codes, but people are very capricious in which particular diagnostic codes they pick and so on. Anyway, so that 58 million project, but then also our service monitoring work, which I think is really important. So we did the Service Restoration Observatory, looking at changes in clinical activity and outcomes during COVID, where actually there was an incredibly reassuring, but also I mean, maybe I'm a bit soppy, but I actually found this quite moving when it first fell off the machine. We were looking at across the entire universe of all clinical activity and outcomes during COVID. We developed some code to look for things that changed, and in particular to look for things that dropped off and then came back, things that dropped off and didn't come back, and things that never dropped off. And to give you two examples, if you look at cholesterol testing, which to my mind is wildly overdone anyway.
That will go down well domestically here. Yeah.
At the peak of the pandemic, cholesterol testing in primary care dropped off to almost nothing, literally almost nothing. I'm certain that anybody who was getting a cholesterol test then, it was in full bloods and somebody just ticked cholesterol as an afterthought. Nobody got their cholesterol done. As soon as wave one was over, it reverted back to normal, and disappointingly maybe. By contrast, INR tests for patients on warfarin. So for non-clinicians, this is the blood thinner warfarin has got a very narrow therapeutic index. It's easy to have too much or too little on board. So you have to really, really regularly check people's clotting to make sure they're not at a risk of a bleed or at a risk of undertreatment leading to a clot that you're trying to prevent. And so if you look at INR testing in patients on warfarin, not a blip in the graph. And nobody told GPs what to do. But collectively, across the entire community of tens of thousands of clinicians during a global health emergency, and lots of us can remember what a strange and confusing time that was, everybody did the right thing. It's extraordinary, really, really extraordinary. And to be able to monitor that at practice level and identify outliers within that overarching pattern is an extraordinary thing.
That's fabulous, actually. Well done. Let's change the subject. We're nearly finished, but people are interested in you as well. I mean, your family background is intriguing, isn't it, Ben? So tell us a bit about your background.
Well, so firstly, I'm slightly obsessed about not sharing anything about my life, in part because I've had stalkers and strangeness, but
no, I didn't. I meant your parents.
No, I know. But I mean, if you talk about privilege, I've got the biggest and best ones. My dad is an epidemiologist, and indeed, literally does the same job as me in the same organisation. He's professor of healthcare epidemiology and ran large teams building electronic health record research platforms.
So is this you are indeed the living image of your dad professionally. Is this nature or nurture?
Well, actually, it's interesting. So in testament actually to, I think, the really unhelpful sort of marginalized status of data infrastructure, I do actually remember my dad, like on walks when I was a kid, explaining things like, well, I'll do studies on whether people who drink a lot of alcohol are more likely to get lung cancer, but then it might be that people who drink alcohol are also smokers. And so the way you fix that is by stratifying. And I remember him explaining it, but actually I don't remember my dad ever discussing anything at all about the meat and drink of building platforms, of engaging with local NHS services to obtain data and then work with it to do service improvement as well as pure research projects. And so I'm now in the rather sort of baffling position. You go up with the kids at the weekend and I'll talk about something frustrating that's happened with the Department of Health or some bit of the NHS, and he'll go, oh yeah, I remember in 1981 we had a very similar argument with a... Anyway, so that's my dad. And then even more, my mum was a pop singer and was #1 all over Europe and Australia, and sang the Kenny Everett theme tune, and all that stuff. She did a song called Single Bed. She's called Nusha Fox. Pop fans. And, you know, to a greater or lesser extent, you could say I am fundamentally a stage epidemiologist. So
yes.
It's convergent blending of the two. Yeah.
I remember you at the Hammersmith Apollo with Richard Dawkins and all of that lot. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I've done, lots of...
Was it the 80th Christmas or something you called it? Or
done that. Uncaged Monkeys.
Oh yeah, Robert, he was doing it as well. Robin Ince, yeah.
Stand-up solo.
Have you stopped doing that? I mean, you yourself told the Times Higher that, you know, you've stopped now showing off writing books and doing theatre shows. Have you really?
Without being too self-disclosive, I like to take good 7-year runs of focusing on trying to get good at one thing. I mean, that's not to say that I think I succeed at that, but so I gave it a solid 7-year run. I will go back to it. I mean, writing books in particular, I think, is a really interesting process, because all the most interesting things yet to be explained to the public are things where you can't do it in 5 minutes or 800 words. And actually the interesting challenge of writing a book is creating a through narrative, especially in the era of the internet, when each individual morsel of information is freely and universally accessible. The value added with a book is taking people on a journey, it's sequencing it, it's knowing that to understand C and D, you have to know a little bit about A and B first. But to explain A and B, you do need to give a bit of a preamble about C and D, which is where you're going. All of that, and all of the, you know, you've got to make it like a Pixie song. You've got to go loud bit, quiet bit, funny bit, tearjerker. All of that structure is good fun. So I will go back to that. And, you know, stand-up shows have been stolen from us by the pandemic. I mean,
they're back now. They're back.
Yeah, true. Well, yeah, less well populated than they used to be. I must say, I mean, I really loved doing all of that stuff, but I honestly feel sufficiently loved by my mum and dad that I'm not really seduced by the approval of strangers. I don't think I need it. And I think that's quite a healthy place to be. And I think that also gives you a degree of the right kind of power. I mean, in terms of professional career stuff, I've always worked very hard. I've never been particularly super rich, but I've always worked very hard to have 2 strands of income: a day job income and a showing off income, so that if the day job became dreadful, I wouldn't have to tolerate a dreadful day job, that there's an outside option. But similarly, I really never wanted to feel that I had to dumb down what I was doing or go and write for the Daily Mail after all. I mean, I have actually written for the Daily Mail. I think it's a fantastic platform to reach people. And a lot of their journalism, especially the Mail on Sunday, is really, really good. But alongside all of the well-documented problems. But I never wanted to feel like I had to do things that I didn't think were useful in order to make money. So I've always worked very hard to have open options. Although actually part of that is also, to an extent, accepting that you don't necessarily need to be tremendously wealthy. I only mention that actually because the other day I met somebody who I really annoyed about 10 years ago when they said they wanted advice on how to be a writer. And I said, the first thing you've got to do is accept that you probably won't make any money from it, but it's going to take up an enormous amount of time. And so you should find a way to set your life up so that you can survive on less money. And they thought that was terrible advice, and, you know, not giving them the affection and admiration that they deserved for their as yet unstarted book.
Now, Ben, don't go away. Don't go away. I've just got to do just a quick little bit of housekeeping. which I've now gone and lost, in fact, so probably I'm not going to do it. So I've just lost completely. But who's coming up next? We've got two, hopefully the magic will suddenly appear. There we are. Excellent. Good. So our next COVID episode, next Thursday, Hans Kluge, the Director General of WHO Europe, is going to be interviewed by Martin McKee, a great favorite of many of you. You'll know Hans, he's the kind of sober person who tells us all about COVID from Europe, but he's actually incredibly interesting. He did all his work in the Russian prisons and prison camps on TB, and then Myanmar on malaria. So he's been in all the world's difficult places and has a most extraordinary life story, actually, well worth coming. And then in Conversation series, we've got next coming up is Chan Nagpal, who's the boss of the BMA, a most charming and fascinating and actually very witty man. So I think it'll be Roger talking to him. And the week after that, we have Jennifer Dixon from the Health Foundation, the boss of the Health Foundation. So we've been a bit into health for the next two series of that. Now, back to you, Ben. First of all, let me just say, because you said it, but I shall now repeat it because it's true. I think what you've done already is indeed a landmark in British science. I remember reading your OpenSAFELY stuff and then the results and just feeling, that finally you'd cracked the Gordian knot that none of us had ever been able to do. And often sometimes in efforts to do so had made things worse. You've clearly made things much better and you've opened up a whole new dimension, and your report, I hope, it generally has been very well received, actually. You've even got praise from Medical Confidential, which is not easy to get. So well done. And so that's fantastic. Of course, we remember you for, I've lost my copy now and I've got it here. We do remember you for your bad science. I remember I've got here your collection of your essays, selected writing. I think you'll find it's a bit more complicated than that.
Most sanctimonious book title in British publishing.
No, it's not. Nonsense. And we all have our favourites. And if you'd stopped talking, we'd run nothing to say. We might have gone over a few of your greatest hits there, but you didn't stop talking and you had so much to say, we didn't even have to do that. But I thought I would end with the one in your collection, which is not Guardian at all, but is you wrote, and you republished in this, the foreword to the Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch Railway Guidebook, because you are a bit of a geek.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of all forms of infrastructure, including railway infrastructure. There's something magical with trains in particular. I'm not very interested in engines, but the notion of a reconfigurable network, and if you think about it, if you sort of sit at the edge of a rail in Didcot Parkway or something, you could, if you set the points correctly going through the Channel Tunnel, you could, on a single strip of metal with tolerances of never more than a deviation of a few millimeters, get all the way to Ankara. And that's an extraordinary thing. And also just the way that it's kind of temporary occupation of space. If you're in a field and a train goes past from Oxford to Manchester, from London to Manchester, there's an urban bubble that sort of flies through with all the hustle and bustle, and then you're in a field, and it's an extraordinary thing. So I love trains, and I have a particular fetish for narrow gauge railways. It's true. The Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch Railway, I must say, if anybody's ever in the mood to go, is utterly extraordinary, because it runs from Romney all the way out to Dungeness Nuclear Power Station.
Oh yes, cycle there.
That's one of my other great fetishes is nuclear installations.
No, let's stick those.
In fact, I've got this is a mirror from the inside of a Royal Observatory Corps nuclear fallout monitoring bunker. They were in a network, 7 miles triangular lattice across the entire country. I nearly bought one for 10 grand 20 years ago. I feel very sad.
Oh God, well, we might need them again. Yeah, but you're right with trains though. I mean, the opening line of Pull Through Great Railway Result, I've never seen a train go past without wanting to be on it. Now you got one more artifact to ring us out of the program or whatever it is. I'm sure I've seen you do that. I've seen that before. Have you got it near with you?
I mentioned this earlier, didn't I?
Yes, good man.
Bits of railway infrastructure kicking around in here, and this is I feel like this should be on the sort of on the office wall of every hospital chief executive, it's a signal box indicator. It's got 3 options that it can indicate: on, off, and wrong.
Brilliant. Ben, you are fabulously right. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Huge response from everybody watching. And so thank you so much for giving us your time, and keep it up, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks all. Cheerio. Read the review and send me an email. Cheers.
Good night all. Thank you very much.